Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romain is an exponent of Reform Judaism and a familiar figure on television and radio. He has a PhD in Jewish history and has either written or participated in writing no less than 15 books, all of them related to his Jewish faith. He's also been a regular contributor to The Guardian, The Huffington Post, The Independent, and The Jewish Chronicle, and he's won many awards along the way, including an MBE in 2003 for his pioneering work in helping mixed faith couples. He's chair of many Jewish and interfaith organisations. Most prominent among them, from a humanist perspective, was the Accord Coalition, which he helped found and indeed chaired until 2018. I think it's fair to describe Jonathan as a pragmatic liberal. He may disagree with that, and we'll find out. But when it comes to the Old Testament teachings, he has long been a supporter of same-sex marriage, a campaigner against religious discrimination in same-sex schools, a champion of women's rights, and a leading proponent of the Dignity in Dying campaign. He's also a supporter of the legalisation of brothels, which must surely have raised a few eyebrows among some of his more conservative colleagues. With all this, he's been a rabbi at Maidenhead Synagogue for over 40 years, and of which he is now director. It's a job that he says has provided a deep sense of belonging within his local community, has sustained him and provided him with immense job satisfaction. He's also the first ever religious leader to be interviewed by Humanistically Speaking. So welcome, Jonathan, and thank you very much for joining us here today.
Good to be with you.
Right, just a little bit of background. You were born in Hampstead in London, but can you give us a brief on what circumstances led you to becoming a rabbi?
Well, when you said I was born in Hampstead, I think I spent 2 nights there in the hospital. So I was actually more or less brought up for my formative and until teenage years in Ruislip in Middlesex, not too far away from Harrow. And I came from a family that was not desperately religious, but was sort of traditional. And had we didn't go to synagogue that often, but had home observances. And I enjoyed being Jewish. I particularly enjoyed Jewish history and Jewish roots, and I wanted to learn more. And back in those days, I say those days because nowadays a lot of universities have Jewish studies courses, but back in those days there really wasn't the opportunity to actually study Judaism unless you became a rabbi. And I thought that's what I would do, gain the knowledge and probably end up as an academic. But as part of the rabbinic course, the last sort of couple of years are like a sort of sandwich course, and you spend the midweek in the classes and weekends out in the congregation. And to my surprise, I actually liked congregational work. And I found it very satisfying and fulfilling. And so I sort of changed plans, really. And instead of becoming an academic, even though I did go on to do a PhD, I actually became a communal rabbi and have never looked back since.
So that's fascinating. So you didn't come from a rabbinical family at all?
Not at all. No, you could say I was the black sheep of the family from being religious.
Okay, well, let's get on to the closer stuff. Do you believe in an afterlife? I mean, what do you think is going to happen to non-believers like me after I die?
Well, I think what will happen to you is what's going to happen to all of us, frankly. So I wouldn't discriminate between believers and non-believers. And Judaism, I think, is pretty rational about it, in that unlike other faiths, particularly Christianity, which has sort of a map of the hereafter with heaven and hell and stopping off points like perdition and limbo, we just simply say we don't know. I mean, to put it crudely, no one's ever sent a postcard back. And so there are all sorts of different legends and images. One I sometimes give is that it's a bit like you and I are a bit like a raindrop, in which we come from the heavens or the sky and hit a tree. And as that raindrop goes down the tree, it's sort of, you can see it, and you can see the course it pursues, and then at the bottom of the tree, it drops into a puddle. Now, the raindrop is still there, but it doesn't have an individual identity. Maybe, or maybe we're just like a matchstick, once it goes out, that's it. But to be honest, I don't really care. And Judaism says, look, anything you say is pure speculation. What really important is what we can affect in the here and now. Do I help somebody? Am I going to be selfish? Am I going to be smiling or scowling? So it's very much a sort of here and now religion, and the afterworld can look after itself if it exists.
I must admit, I like the raindrop analogy. I think that's really good. It's something that I shall bear in mind. Thank you for that. Well, you're on record as being an exponent of the Reform School of Jewry, which is only established relatively recently. And I say relatively recently because it was in the 1820s or 30s, I think, when it started. But I believe it's now adopted by nearly 20% of Jews in the UK. You're not really a minority group at all. So what is essentially different about the Reform School, and why do you think it's become so popular among Jewish people?
Just to go back a bit, I mean, Judaism has always changed. I mean, the same with Christianity in any faith. You know, if Moses came back today, he would not recognize Jewish life. If Jesus came back to life, he'd have a fit and wouldn't know what to do in church or what it was all about. So, you know, religions claim they are traditional, but actually they've changed enormously. And I suppose Reform Judaism tries to marry at its best to the tradition and change and keep the best of the traditions of the past with the realities of modernity. So, for instance, if you went to a Reform synagogue, instead of all being in Hebrew as in Orthodox, it'll be a mixture of Hebrew and English. Instead of being men at the front, women at the back, as in Orthodox, it will be men and women together because we regard women as equal. It just almost feels daft to say it, and we have women rabbis. We also will adapt to new situations like intermarriage, which was, you know, once upon a time the ultimate taboo. You know, marrying out with sticking two fingers up against God, rejecting your past. Now we just see it as, well, that's the way modern life is. Or similarly, we'll accept gay people as not as sort of evil or corrupt, but that's the way God created them, and just not an issue. So really, reform is about the C word, change, the right to change and to adapt. And I suppose that's really why it appeals to people who want to be religious and realistic, have a sense of roots in the past, but also live in modernity as well.
I think that's very interesting. Actually, there's a significant number of ex-Jewish people or people who identify with the Jewish faith who are humanists and active humanists, as you probably know.
So, well, I'm not surprised to hear that because, you know, I sort of would describe Judaism as a three-legged stool, one being God, the other being rituals, and the third being humanism or you know, ethics, values. So we're not a million miles apart.
No, that's good to hear. I'm sure we're not. So anyway, of all the religions existing today, the Jewish faith has by far the greatest history of being persecuted, and I'm sure you've been asked this question many times before. And it's clearly had an impact on Jewish folklore, but what are the main effects it's had on Jewish culture? Has it changed anything profound in the Jewish faith?
Well, you're right to say there's been a lot of persecution, but I mean, Jewish history isn't just a history of persecution, and then there have been many golden ages where Jews have been part of wider society, welcomed by society, integrated into it, whether it was the Jews of Babylon in the 8th century, or the Jews of Spain in the 15th century, or the Jews of Poland in the 17th, or if you could say Jews of the West today. So there have been many golden ages. And so, and of course, even when there have been persecutions, it hasn't been worldwide. It may have been in this country and not in that country. So in some instances, Jewish culture has developed very inwardly. In other cultures and times, it's developed outwardly and interacted with society at large. So it's a very mixed picture.
Okay, so just moving on a little bit from that onto Hasidic schools or Jewish unregistered Hasidic schools. As you know, I once lived in Stamford Hill, and I was aware of some schools that existed there. But what would your approach be to how they're supervised? Or should they even exist at all? What's your view about that?
You're talking about unregistered schools, yes?
Yeah, unregistered specifically.
Yeah, well, they're illegal. You know, that's it, end of story. They shouldn't exist. The same would apply to unregistered Muslim schools or unregistered Plymouth Brethren schools, or, you know, schools need to be monitored and supervised, partly from an educational point of view and what the children are being the content, so that they're not being indoctrinated I don't know, homophobic or antisocial views, or being denied access to education because some of these schools, they don't learn English or they don't learn maths, but also just simple health and safety. You know, is there an escape route in case of a fire? You know, so any school that's unregistered, whatever faith, it shouldn't happen.
Okay, that's very, very clear. I want to move on now to the question of circumcision. Again, this must be an ongoing thing that you would have been asked about. But the fundamental of that is the question of whether a baby, a newborn baby, who's born into a Jewish family, is a Jewish baby. And I mean, is it appropriate to circumcise a baby boy before he's old enough to decide for himself? So I have to ask you the question, why is it necessary to perform this ceremony at such a young age?
Oh, well.
Are you defending it at all? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, okay, circumcision is probably one of the oldest Jewish traditions. It goes right back to Genesis, the first book of the Bible. It is seen really as an act of identity, as much as by the parents, of course, because as you rightly say, the child hasn't got a clue. So it's a conscious passing on of the Jewish tradition. The issue of safety and health, well, of course, as parents, we force our children to do all sorts of things, whether it's learning the alphabet or playing the piano. And of course, I can tell you that, you know, Jewish parents, if you want to stereotype them, are bonkers about their children's health. If for one moment we thought that it was dangerous to health, it would have been jettisoned, like so much of Judaism in the Bible. And I'm speaking not as a rabbi, but as a dad of 4 boys. And of course, as you well know, it's quite common in other countries for non-Jewish people like Australia and America, where it's done for health reasons. Now, of course, you can be perfectly healthy without being circumcised. I'm not saying it's essential, but there is that sort of side effect. In fact, we did a synagogue trip to South Africa not so long ago. We do them to different countries every year. And there was this wonderful series of posters, giant, enormous posters we saw all over Johannesburg, saying, with a woman with a sort of very inviting look in her eye, saying, "I like it condomized and circumcised." And that was part of their campaign against AIDS.
Well, okay. Well, I should imagine that after that, lots of uncircumcised men queuing up for the operation. I think it could be very popular. Okay, well, thank you very much. That is very clear. But I'm going to move on to another aspect of the Jewry, which relates to animals and animal, you might say, cruelty. Is kosher really necessary? And if it is necessary, could you just explain why? And can animals be stunned before ceremonial killing takes place? That's a very emotive issue among humanists.
Yeah, I mean, the word kosher, by the way, is a Hebrew word. It means sort of fit or proper or appropriate or okay. In other words, it's a type of food that one's allowed to eat. And for instance, as you well know, we're not supposed to eat pork or shellfish. And that was originally for health reasons, because, you know, if you read in your local paper someone's got food poisoning, you can bet your life they've had oysters or eels or shellfish, because even today, they are the ones that go off quickest. I think what you're talking about is a method of slaughter, which is a slightly different thing from the type of animal one eats.
Yes.
I have very little doubt in my mind that it is as good a method of killing as any other. Now, I'm not to say that that won't change, but I think there are obviously the problem is that pre-stunning is still not 100% as good as it could be. And if you've ever been to an abattoir, you will never eat meat again. You know, an ordinary abattoir with or without pre-stunning. If you've seen chickens thrown into these pools of water with electric currents in and see them sort of electrocuted to death as a part of pre-stunning, you will never eat meat again. So killing is actually quite a difficult thing to do. And I think that the way that a kosher animal is slaughtered, which is with an extraordinarily sharp knife with one single cut, not any hacking, but just literally one cut to the carotid artery in the throat, means that there is immediate loss of blood and consciousness even before it dies. Now, there may come a time, and by the way, the whole point of that is to be, if you're going to kill, and by the way, there's a very good argument for being vegetarian, and vegetarian has always been an acceptable option within Judaism. And the rabbis say that actually in the Garden of Eden, we were vegetarian, and in the Messianic times, whenever that is, we will go back to it. So actually, vegetarianism is seen as an ideal, but eating meat is a concession to the modern life. If it does come a time where pre-stunning really is sufficient, and again, there's a problem with bolt shotguns, then it may be we will have to rethink. But until now, I'm fairly convinced that the kosher method of slaughter is as good as the current one, the other ones.
But if you do stun an animal and it doesn't, or try to stun an animal, it doesn't work, you can still you can still kill it, can't you? You can still slaughter it. And if it's not stunned, it's the same thing, isn't it? If the stunning goes wrong, or if it isn't stunned, what's the difference?
Well, the problem is that if you if the stunning isn't done exactly right, and for instance the stun gun bolt doesn't go in exactly in the right position in the brain, then the animal is still half conscious.
Okay. Right. Okay. I'll go now to my background a little bit. As a boy of about 12, I worked for a while in the synagogue in Neasden, and I was asked, and was happy to wear a skull cap whilst I was in the synagogue, even though I'm not Jewish. But what is the meaning? I never really understood the meaning of wearing the little hat and why it's so important for boys in particular to wear it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because actually it is nowhere mentioned in the Bible whatsoever. It's like a lot of things in Judaism and religion, it's a later development, and really it was just a sort of an act of prayer, and of getting into the prayer mode, a bit like, you know, Christians take their hats off, Muslims take their sandals off, Jews put their hats on. In itself, there is no sort of innate sanctity, and of course, if you want to say a prayer without your head being covered, you can say a prayer, but it's just one of those things you do, just one of the rituals that sort of gets you in the mode.
Have you got any idea how that came about?
Well, it was a slow development. I mean, the only person in the Bible to wear a head covering was Aaron, the brother of Moses, who was the high priest, and which, by the way, is why the Pope also wears a head covering, because he sees himself as a successor, spiritual successor to Aaron and the high priest. And then what happened, it became that the person who led prayers had a head covering. It's almost like a badge of authority. And then it became a traditional for everyone to wear a head covering. And now there are some Jews, the ultra-Orthodox, who will wear a head covering at all times.
Yes.
So
yes.
it's really sort of an act of piety that has developed over the years, over the centuries.
Well, later on in my life, I lived in Stamford Hill in London for some years in an overwhelmingly Hasidic neighbourhood. And I was very happy there. I recall being particularly popular, especially on a Saturday when something needed doing. But our immediate neighbours were secular Jews, and they were entirely rejected and excluded from the wider community. I felt a bit sorry for them. I think they're quite sort of lonely. I've understood since that there is a serious division between the two communities. And if that is the case, it's very sad. But is there a way of bridging the differences between them? Or do you think there's no division at all?
Oh, yes, there are divisions within Jews, just as there are within Christians. I mean, you know, we talk about what Catholics and Protestants and Lutherans and Calvinists, and you know, you can go on forever. And this isn't about religion. This is about humans. It's you know, you often find that the differences you have with people who are closer to you are bigger than those who are outside. You know, there was that lovely scene in the sort of Life of Brian by Monty Python, when there was this sort of battle between the Liberation for Judea Front and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Judea and the Judean Popular Front Liberation.
I remember
well. And they all claim to be the real thing. In fact, I went to a an interfaith gathering a few years back between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and then we all broke up for lunch. And I sort of expected that all the Jews would sit on one table, the Christians on another, and all the Muslims on the third. And just because we would, naturally gravitate to your own. In fact, what happened was something very different. All the Orthodox Christians, Muslims, and Jews sat on one table, and all the progressive, liberal, modern Christians, Jews, and Muslims sat on another, because in a sense we had more in common with each other because we had a sort of different view of worldview on life.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. It just shows that people connect with people that are like them, rather than sharing that kind of vague, the wider philosophy. I mean, the wider community in Stamford Hill where I lived, they're included, though, not only Hasidic Jews, but also Islamic communities. And whilst I'm not aware of any dialogue between those two communities, I was never aware of any sense of conflict between them. And I thought, when I reflect on that now, I think that's a hopeful vision for the wider world. I mean, but do you think that it'll ever be possible for evangelistic religions to cohabit in the same place? Because there seems to be so much conflict, not just with Islam or Jewish religion, but with lots of different religions.
Yes, it's one of those sadnesses, isn't it? That religions which actually at their core believe in, like humanists, love your neighbour as yourself, and that, you can just reduce every faith to that, more or less, seem to still argue and be combative. I mean, going to your particular point, there's actually no reason why Islam and Judaism should have particular differences. In fact, in many ways, they actually share more in common than Jews and Christians. The problem has only been really in the last sort of 50, 60 years over what's happening in the Middle East, and it's more of a political issue rather than any religious division. And as you know, for instance, or you may not know, that, for instance, if Muslims who keep halal and observe halal food, if they're on an airline or in an area where they can't get any halal food, they will eat kosher food instead, because it's totally acceptable for them.
That's interesting, isn't it? But so you mentioned then about Israel and the Middle East. I mean, do you have any thoughts about the current Israeli-Palestinian troubles? My own feeling is that I think the Palestinians have got their backs to the wall here. You may have a different point of view.
Well, I've got no solution, because nobody has a solution, frankly, and it's been going on, for a long time, and frankly, it reminds me a little bit of what's going on in our own backyard in Northern Ireland. And can you think of the 2 or 3 centuries it's taken us to get to where we are? And we're talking about people of the same faith, and the problem is, of course, it's a clash of two rights. And how do you reconcile that? I think something that's changed quite a lot is that whereas Israel was pretty divided, a bit like this country, between right and left, the left in Israel has collapsed in terms of the peace process, simply because of what happened. Because, as you know, the Palestinian territory, which was originally going to be Palestine with the United Nations Declaration resolution in 1947, was going to be half in Gaza and half in the West Bank. And let's fast forward. The Palestinians now control Gaza, or Israel actually withdrew from Gaza, if you remember. And the hope was that there would be peace with Gaza, but of course Hamas took over Gaza. And, for whatever reason, Gaza has constantly been fighting with Israel. So the Israelis now feel, look, we gave the land back to the Palestinians in Gaza. We're constantly being bombarded by them. They're putting their money into underground tunnels rather than in universities and hospitals. We're not going to make the same mistake with the West Bank. Now, if Gaza had really developed and become a sort of flourishing new country, then I'm sure the same would have happened with the West Bank. But it didn't, and that's why Israelis are very nervous of exchanging of the traditional formula, exchanging land for peace. And again, what's extraordinary, that always seems so extraordinary to me, is people just forget how small Israel is. I mean, Israel is the size of Wales, So it's a tiny, tiny country. It has to be very conscious of its security. And it's often said that it doesn't matter how many wars the Arab population loses, because they've got 26 states. If Israel loses one war, that's the end of it. So there's a real nervousness, which isn't to say that Israel is perfect or does everything right. Of course it doesn't. But there is no obvious solution in sight. And unfortunately, it's partly to do with the leadership. And we're just going to have to wait till the new generation of leaders who perhaps got the courage and the confidence to try a different route. But I don't see anything changing at present.
I was surprised that one of our members pointed out that the story of Israel, the modern story of Israel, actually begins a long time before 1948. It goes back to Lloyd George. Apparently, the British had quite a strong influence on the establishment of a separate land, a particular land for Jews that they hadn't had for 2,000 years.
Yes, and this is what's, I think, called the Balfour Declaration in 1917, where the British government committed itself to the establishment of a Jewish homeland. Remembering, of course, that this is like not something new. It's like the third state of Israel, because Jews have been there since biblical times. And if you look at the Bible, you will see places like Jerusalem or Jericho or Beersheba or Dan, which are still there. So in other words, it's not like, to be honest, taking over a new territory. It's actually going back to a territory that they always used to have.
Mm. Okay, and now I think it's fair to say that you are known as a particularly liberal rabbi. You criticise selection discrimination in faith schools, as I started, and you're a supporter of women's rights, dignity in dying. I know that there's an issue going on about dignity in dying. I don't know if you want to expand on that at all. And also, I'll be interviewing a representative from the English Collective of Prostitutes in a few weeks' time. So I'm sure they'll be very happy to hear your views about legalizing brothels. But these views must have put you into some conflicts with other elements within the Jewish community. I mean, how do you persuade your liberal views to them?
Well, I mean, how do you push any cause? You just have to, be articulate, confident, and yes, it does mean sticking your head above the parapet. And if I showed you the number of knives I've got in my back, but to be honest, I feel that I've actually, I'm not going to say that I've been right every time, but I've won most of the arguments. And when in the 1980s, I started saying we need to be much more welcoming to mixed faith couples, believe it or not, it was revolutionary. Now it's taken as common sense, and most rabbis, or actually not just rabbis, but vicars and priests will also say, well, yes, we're not wild about mixed faith marriages. We think that it's better to marry within your faith for all sorts of reasons, but we recognize reality and we can't legislate for whom you fall in love with, and therefore you are equally welcome in the community. Whereas back then, it was the ultimate sin. So, I feel I've won the argument there. I think I'm winning the argument.
I think that's very brave, actually.
Thank you. I think I'm winning the argument on faith schools, which I've always felt were divisive. I strongly believe in faith. I think it should, but I think it should come from the home and the church and the mosque and the Gurdwara and the synagogue. But it shouldn't be forced on children 9 to 3, Monday to Friday, and particularly not used to divide the children. So you get Jews going to one school, Hindus another, Catholics another, because what it does is it divides the children. And how bonkers is that? And particularly in a society where we're multi-faith, multi-racial, multi-traditional, it's really important that the children grow up not as strangers, but knowing about each other. And so I sent my children not to a local Jewish day school, which I had the opportunity to do, but to a local school, because I wanted them to sit next to a Christian and play football with a Hindu and do homework with a Muslim and get detention with a Catholic and walk home with a Rastafarian, and that was important, and I think that's the right way for society. And I think there's also gradual realization now that faith schools can be divisive, and that there's been quite a lot of moves to change things such as entry requirements or collective worship. And in fact, one notable success we had was when Michael Gove started up the, what are they called, the academies. He introduced a rule which was a direct result, actually, of the Accord Coalition and also other forces working together, that the faith academies could only take a maximum of 50% of any one faith, precisely so that you didn't end up with, you know, just all Jewish, all Muslim, all Catholic, and the children did have a chance to mix and match.
Some people are trying to change that, aren't they? Which is, I think, is desperately disappointing. With respect to faith schools or the mixing of children, I couldn't agree with you more. I believe passionately that children should mix together, and in fact, the difficulty with having specific faith at schools is it develops ghettos of particular ideologies, particular faiths, because parents will naturally gravitate to particular schools, and I think it's extremely dangerous for the future of society. Look at Northern Ireland.
Yes, exactly. Well, Northern Ireland is a good example because, you know, no one would say that the problems came because of faith schools, but there's no doubt that the divisions were exacerbated by faith schools and Catholic and Protestant children growing up as, if not strangers, then enemies. And what's really interesting now is the rise of integrated schools. And a very high percentage of parents are now sending their children to integrated schools, which cover both communities, precisely because they want to start afresh. And I think that's the way forward. And of course, you know, even in this country, you know, schools are for what? Largely for education, and presumably what we want children to be intolerant. We want them to be tolerant and inclusive. And and yet, what message do we give if we separate them at the school gate?
Absolutely.
So if we want a tolerant, inclusive society, we have to have a tolerant, inclusive school system that produces it.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. And moving on from that, and related to that, I believe you started the Accord Coalition. Now, as far as I know, that has active representation from all faiths and includes Humanist UK, which I personally applaud. I don't know if you're still involved with that, but when you started it, I mean, has it fulfilled all of what you had in mind? I mean, what are the successes and the failures of Accord, in your opinion?
Yes, I was chair, the first chair for 10 years, and I'm now the president, and Stephen Terry has taken over. And what it did is it united all the different groups, both religious and non-religious, like the Humanist UK. And whereas what we tried to do was two things. Firstly, give a voice to people like you and me who had our opinions, but like no one was listening to particular individuals. So we became a campaigning organization. And to be honest, we were very successful and punched way above our weight, because in the early days, it was just me and one coordinator, who's now Paul Pettinger. And, you know, we got access to everywhere, whether it was sort of the Church of England Synod or number 10 Downing Street or the media. And we were able to give a voice to the concerns that you and I have just discussed. And, you know, put it on the agenda. We had the particular success I just mentioned of Michael Gove introducing the 50% rule. Theresa May actually did try and reverse that, but again, we campaigned and stopped her doing that. And frankly, I would like the next step to be that all schools have a 50% rule, so that you don't have these educational ghettos, and, you know, just so that we have children who are better prepared to enter into this multi-faith society that we have.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's music to my ears, actually, to hear that. So, looking from the outside in, as with many other established religions, there seems to be a whole range of different and fragmented shades of belief. There's nothing special about the Jewish faith in that. There are lots of different variations. But it doesn't seem to be a particularly happy situation for any faith, including Jewish faith. I mean, do you think it's more important for Jewry to reach some sort of accord with other elements within the Jewish faith and to find ways of working together as one? Or should faiths seek ways of finding an accord with the secular world and through that find a kind of happy medium? Which do you think is more important or more relevant, do you think?
Well, again, I would say this is a human problem, not a Jewish one. I mean, I would, and I hope I'm not going to offend anyone and say, I'm not entirely convinced that the Humanist UK and the secular society are best friends. You know, so even within the non-religious systems, there are divisions.
Humanistically speaking, is friends to both, I can assure you. But I take your point.
Yeah. So, you know, why are humanists and secularists different? I mean, to me, as a Jewish person, you know, it doesn't stand to reason. But I'm sure those within each organisation will be able to point to significant differences.
You can be a religious secularist. You can't really be a religious humanist. I think that's okay.
You know, I don't want to go down that route. I'm just pointing out that differences, even within what you would ostensibly think are similar groups, are still there. I think what's interesting is that one of the big successes of religion over the last maybe 50 or 60 years has been interfaith dialogue, and that whereas not so much Judaism, because it didn't have a problem with other faiths, but the more evangelistic ones, like Christianity, who saw other faiths as rivals, or in a sense, have put that aside. And there's been a real flowering of interfaith dialogue, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, Baha'is, but whatever. And that's been great, and it's been genuine. It started at the top on clergy level. It's now permeated down to sort of laity level. And the really interesting thing about that is the unintended consequence, in that at these, say, for instance, there's the Council of Christians and Jews. At the Council of Christians and Jews, there would be Catholics and Protestant clergy who would never meet normally.
Yeah.
But under the banner of Council of Christians and Jews, they did. And it was the same with us. Orthodox and Reformed rabbis wouldn't be seen dead with each other, so to speak. But because it was an interfaith organization, they could meet. And actually, interfaith dialogue had the knock-on effect of leading to intra-faith dialogue, and actually has benefited relations within all the different communities. And that would, you know, I mean, the Muslims, are you Sunni or Shia? And neither of them will speak the Ahmadiyans. So, you know, we've all got our particular prejudices and discriminations within our own faiths, but we're gradually, painfully, slowly learning to live with them.
I think communication and dialogue is so vitally important. I remember I was a humanist celebrant for a while, for about 6 years, I think. And for a while, before I became a celebrant, I was a fairly angry sort of atheist, the classic sort of angry atheist. But when I became a celebrant, I met lots of people who were doing the same job as me, effectively, who were vicars and priests and all kinds of different people, different attitudes. And that taught me a great deal, because it taught me that, you know, the bottom line is when we reach out to each other as human beings, not as humanist or Christian or whatever, but when we see each other regularly as people, and it breaks down all the barriers. You can't hate someone who makes you laugh, or, you know, someone you like or you get on with. You know, I think that's so important, and that's why I feel so strongly about religious ghettos. I think it's just a disaster. It just separates people. Awful. Okay, I just want to. We've been talking quite a lot about the condition of Judaism in the UK. What do you think is the state of Jewry in the UK today? Is it healthy, or do you think it's in need of TLC? I know that in Maidenhead, in particular, I believe your congregation has increased enormously over the years. But is that general?
Well, it is a bit of a mixed picture because, I mean, it's very hard to stereotype Jews in that it's a very diverse community, you know, and they range from the ultra-Orthodox or Hasidic to the ultra-liberal who still feel Jewish, to all the different groups in between. I mean, by and large, except for the ultra-Orthodox, Jews are very integrated into wider society. And I think that's why the Corbyn era was such a shock, because, you know, for the very, very first time, I mean, a lot of us had sort of experienced anti-Semitism on a low level, like, you know, maybe being bullied by some idiot at school, or seeing some graffiti on a wall or whatever. But, and, you know, that's not very nice, but, you know, just what happens. But for the first time, a political party, a major political party, respectable one, not like British National Front or anything like that, Labour under Corbyn seemed to be, if not anti-Semitic, allowing anti-Semitic elements within it to flourish. And suddenly that really crossed the red line, and Jews who'd really felt very much at home in this country suddenly thought, my goodness me, you know, what's happening? And which is why there was such a strong reaction. And pleasingly, not just by Jews, but by a lot of other people who thought, well, this is not fair or decent. Or if he's got a blind spot about Jews, and what other blind spots does he have? So I'm not going to say that Corbyn's tacit allowance of anti-Semitism caused him to lose the election, but I think it was one of the elements that led to his defeat, and it certainly tarnished the almost sort of saintly halo that he sort of arrived at, you know, when he first became elected, and then suddenly people began to think that this wasn't quite such a great leader after all.
Yeah, I must say, in my own experience of anti-Semitism, all I know about anti-Semitism in this country is what I've read in the newspapers. In my day-to-day life, before I was a humanist, you know, at work and that sort of thing, I can't actually recall any anti-Semitism being experienced. And you know, if it's a problem, then it's not been in my radar. But it is interesting. I'm following a television series which started last Sunday, which I know you are as well, about anti-Semitism in 1960s, in the early 60s. But in 62, I was 14, and I should have been aware of something, but I wasn't aware of it myself. But I just didn't go in those circles, I suppose. I just didn't meet those people. Certainly my parents weren't anti-Semitic. Anyway, my penultimate question for you was to ask you whether you can think of any examples of faiths working in unison together to improve the human condition. And I'm saying this to the founder of Accord. So I think that's a great example of all faiths and none working together.
Yes, and
I might let you off that.
I haven't got a sort of list I can reel off, but if you think about all sorts of issues, whether it was, you know, the Christian William Wilberforce leading the crusade against slavery, or the fact that the RSPCA, we talked about animal welfare, was founded by somebody Jewish, or today, you know, all the major faith leaders have got together over COP26 and are urging politicians to take it seriously. So, you know, this is a sign that religions can work together, but of course it's not exclusive, and they will work together. We will work together with non-religious groups such as Humanist UK, and which is why, you know, I mean, I work very strongly together with them, and particularly Andrew Copson, both on the faith school side, but also on the assisted dying and the attempt to get a sort of bill through the House of Commons, which will permit assisted dying, which would be for people who are terminally ill, mentally competent, and who so wish it.
What can Humanistically Speaking readers do to support the cause for assisted suicide? I know it's a critical point at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah. By the way, I avoid the term suicide because the reason is, not pedantic reasons, but if someone commits suicide, very often, if they had not done so, they would still live on another 20, 30, 40 years. Assisted dying is when someone is dying anyway, and a maximum of 6 months away, if not a few weeks away. And by the way, the assisted bit is not that somebody else does it, because that would be euthanasia. It's that you yourself do it, and the assisted bit is that you get a prescription, if it became legal, from your doctor, and you were able to take some life-ending medication rather than perhaps continue for the last few weeks in agony if you had Parkinson's or motor neuron or something horrible like that.
Thank you for correcting me on that.
Yes, and what humanists can do, and I believe they are, is to, at the moment, lobby peers, because the second reading of the Molly Meacher bill on assisted dying is going through the House of Lords in late October, to give it not just a passing, which I think it will do, but a really, really strong passing, so that it then moves to the Commons, and with a sort of very strong wind behind it.
Okay, well, we've got about 3,000 readers, hopefully, so this is for you people. If you can contact your MP and make your views known, that would help the cause. Okay, so my last question for you is whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about the future. There seems to be an awful lot going on, which is pretty pessimistic, but do you have any thoughts about the next 20 or 25 years? Do you think, are you optimistic?
Well, by nature, whenever I see a glass of water, it's always half full, it's never half empty. And actually, I think that's not just wild optimism. We mentioned, I think, the Ridley Road programme earlier, or that's what you alluded to, and this sort of anti-Semitism, anti-racism as well, in the late 1950s, early 60s. And of course, that's a good example of progress in that, that would not be allowed today because we have things such as the Race Relations Act, or we have the Incitement to Violence Act, or we have, so many mixed faith, mixed race couples today. If you saw the film Peterloo, you would have suddenly realised, what we've done in terms of the welfare state, or having an NHS. So, of course, there's plenty of things wrong, and there's a heck of a lot still to do, and there's nothing claustrophobic about the room for improvement. But, I think we can say that we are doing better than the past, by and large, and there is an upward curve. It's still a lot of work to go, which is why organisations are still needed, whether it's Accord or Dignity in Dying or Humanists or the Jewish community and its social action. But I'm positive.
I imagine you've heard of Steven Pinker. He shares your view very much. I think he's very optimistic. Well, it's been an absolute delight, and thank you very much for the interview. Are there any things that you would like to emphasise or raise to our readers, or any comments you'd like to make?
No, just a very practical one, that it's really important that people who want to help the assisted dying campaign, in other words, for it to become an option, not an obligation, but an option, at this stage to write to peers, and then later when it goes to the Commons, to write to MPs.
That's brilliant. Jonathan Romain, thank you very much. It's been a delight. Thank you.
Humanistically Speaking is a volunteer-run online publication slotting in the gap between National Humanist glossy magazines and Humanist UK's newsletter. We aim to create a platform that can bring humanist groups and individual humanists together, of course, but also to allow non-humanists to join in the debate. We want to explore topics of interest that any freethinker will be concerned about and offer informative, factual articles that encourage people to reflect upon, explore, question, and share ideas. We are in an exciting marketplace of ideas, and it is important that humanists from all stables of opinion have a voice. Humanistically Speaking is unique in offering this. Our remit is constantly developing, and by the start of our second year, we grew from a bi-monthly to a regular monthly issue. We've also expanded from email communication only to launching our own website and created our first values publication, From Atheism to Humanism. All of this has been made possible through your donations and your goodwill, and we're deeply grateful to those supporters among you who have donated already. But this is just the beginning. Our aim is a bold one. In addition to offering our support to National Secular Society and Humanist UK's campaign objectives, we want to share the humanist idea with everyone in society. Naturally, we want to celebrate rational thinking, open inquiry, compassion, fairness and justice, but we want to balance these good things with enjoyment and having fun, a sense of comradeship and the thrill of just being alive. But to go further, we need financial security, and we're asking you to help us. If you approve of what we're doing, please join us on our journey towards the foundation of a national humanist magazine that lends voice to every rational and respectful opinion. We want to explain and celebrate what humanism is and share humanist ideas that we believe can do so much to improve the way we all live. You can help us to achieve these aims by setting up a standing order of £4 a month or whatever you can afford to Humanistically Speaking, or if you're not able to do that, think about giving us a kickstart boost by donating a one-off lump sum of perhaps £20. Our bank details are at the bottom of this screen, but if you prefer, please click on the link below that will take you straight to the appropriate place on our Humanistically Speaking website and follow the guidance given. Every donation will be acknowledged with a message of thanks from us. One last thing before you go, do spread the word with your friends, because Humanistically Speaking is there for everyone. There are also many potential humanists out there who already share our values and yet don't know we exist. There are also humanists who don't have a group nearby and who might be feeling like a lone voice in their communities. We would like to serve them also and play our part in breaking down any sense of isolation. We're doing all we can by committing our time and energy. Please help us with your goodwill and donations and join us on this journey. Thank you.